do rep drop-offs between sets tell us anything about how to adjust our training? That's a good one.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think it does to some extent. I think that if someone has like there is like kind of a standard range, I think, where most people are gonna fall into, and that's going to be something like 2 reps or so, for like a relatively intense set. So like maybe if you were, so it's not like the biggest grinder from hell that you're doing, but it is pretty hard, and you definitely wouldn't have another rep. Um, After that, most people are gonna drop something like 1 or 2 reps, so something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and you know, if someone is dropping like, I don't know, 4 or more, I mean, probably like you could talk about percentages more so, but like, if someone goes from 8 reps to 4, that would be a above average drop off. If someone can maintain their performance, even though it was like a really hard grinder and not after half an hour of rest, but like 3 to 5 minutes even, that would be like definitely above average, like um performance maintenance. And so I think that can inform someone's kind of general volume tolerance, or can inform us about that. So people who like Børge Fagerli, for example, like he responds, like Jeff Alberts, for example,
Mhm.
responds very well to lower volumes. And so he would be one of those people, and I don't think it's just a coincidence, who drops off a lot of reps when he trains. Um, I would say I myself am fairly average, and my rep drop-offs are actually very average. Um, I'm not exactly sure what Jeffrey's are, but I would not be surprised that with his very high volume tolerance, he would not be losing a lot of reps from set to set. So yeah, that's what I tend to think. So yeah, like maybe be more willing to experiment with higher volumes if your reps really don't tend to drop off, even though you're training hard. That would be my answer.
Yeah. I don't think that if somebody were to tell me just the numbers that it would be that informative. Like they just said, hey, like I did a set of 12 and then I did a set of 7 or something. I would, because there's so many factors that could cause a rep drop off. So, but I do think it's a good question
Yeah.
because it could tell you how to adjust your training with more questioning. So first I would say, well, how long are you resting? Right. Obviously that's huge. So I'll do rest pause training and I'll do 16 reps and then I'll drop to 7 reps and then I'll get 5 reps because I'm only resting 40 seconds in between. Right.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so that's obviously a huge factor. Do you need to just rest longer? The other aspect I would say, of course, that you mentioned is proximity to failure. So if I do a set of 10 and it's a 3 RAR, I could get another set of 10 and maybe it's a 1 RAR. And
Yeah.
then maybe I get a final set and it's like 9 to 10, but it was a true all out, like I'm going to die kind of a set. So do you need to go closer to failure if all of if you're able to do 5 sets of 10 with the same weight and 2 minutes of rest time between each set, then you're what that tells me is you need to get closer to failure because your first 2 sets might be 5 RAR in that case, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then thirdly, I do think what Abel pointed out about your tolerance for volume. So let's assume normal rest times of 2 to 4 minutes. Let's assume normal proximity to failure of 1 to 2 RAR, then or even 0 a bit. Let's call it 1 because I mean 0. I think it's like a true 0 RAR. You are going to have a pretty big drop off most of the time.
Yeah.
In that case, then sure, that could probably tell you about your volume tolerance. I've mentioned my buddy Kevin a few times on the podcast. I remember in college, he would get 12 and then he'd get like 11 and then he'd get 11. I was like, how are you doing this? Like I would be doing 12, 7, 5. And if you look at our training, historically, I kind of like lower volume training. Historically, he will tend to do 1 or 2 body parts on a day, do 16 to 20 plus sets, right? And I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. And again,
Yeah.
Jeffrey Berry Schofield is a good example. So if you're keeping all those variables fairly normal, we'll call it, I do think maybe that tells you that you do want to maybe potentially at least experiment with higher volumes and see how well you tolerate them.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
Cool. This one is definitely more like a hypothetical. So And I realize that I haven't been saying everybody's names on
Uh,
here, but hopefully they recognize their own question.
uh-huh.
And this one I'm not even going to pronounce. Matik Polaknik. This is an interesting one. Would a drug that removes all mental exercise fatigue change the way we train? Cardio 2. So like an NZT for mental exercise fatigue. Does that question make sense?
Oh, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question, actually. Of course, my mind immediately went to diet. Like, I think the effect would be more pronounced there. But like, yeah, that's a good question, right? Because like, there is definitely a thing where you like if you do Bulgarian split squats, like, yeah, sure, it does fatigue your quads a lot and like cardiovascularly as well. But there is just the act of hating something so bad that
Yeah.
can be draining.
Yeah.
And that like with these very demanding exercises, like the cardio fatigue and the local muscular fatigue, that's one thing, but also just the process of like knowing that it's gonna be brutal, willing yourself to go there, overcoming that inner like that inertia that and then going there like wanting to quit midway through the set but not quitting, finishing, and then your lungs are burning. Like that initial couple of seconds can be just really bad, and you're like, oh my god, like I wish I could just spit my lungs out here because this hurts so bad.
Yeah.
And then knowing that okay, like 3 minutes is almost up, so I need to go back there and do this again. So like when you go through like 3 4 sets like that, which a lot of people do, like it might seem like, well, if you're hating it that much then just don't do it. But a lot of people, I mean, that's their training life essentially. Like
Hmm.
you look at Dorian Yates training legs, I'm pretty sure it was something like this. If you could just eliminate all of that, and just basically forget that this set ever happened, I'm pretty sure that you could actually tolerate more. So yeah, but it's an interesting thought experiment for sure.
Yeah. I think there's two ways to read the question. So, would it change the way we prescribe and recommend training? Maybe a little bit. Like if you think of what do we recommend as ideal training, maybe it would change it a little bit because inevitably there's going to be a practicality to what we recommend and things like that. I think
Yeah.
if the question is, would it change how we actually train, then of course, I think hugely, right? I mean, you think of the average person, how many they just will not do, multiple sets of heavy squats and deadlifts or leg press, especially like leg days and back days. Most people are going to shy away from the hardest exercises. Most people are going to shy away from true failure because it's difficult, because there's that fatigue within the set, there's the fatigue between the sets. I mean, even hardcore advocates like DC trainees will oftentimes put some of the hardest stuff towards the end of the workout. They actually do their squats and deadlifts at the end because they know that after you do those, you're going to be so fried that you're not going to want to do the rest of your workout. So even people as intense as that are factoring that into their training. So if you just had
Oh, yeah.
some pill where it was basically making it so that you don't have that fatigue in between, even if it's just mentally, that you're just ready to go again, of course, we'd all, I'm sure, train very different. And even more so, I'd say for cardio was the last part of that question. I mean,
Oh,
I've mentioned several times on this podcast, I think I'm more impressed by extreme cardio athletes than I am extreme weightlifting athletes, because
oh.
the amount of just pure suck that you have to go through for some of these things. I mean, 2 hour marathons and, like 50-mile races. I mean, that's just unbelievable. And the mental fortitude that takes is truly admirable.
Yeah, and then like dieting. I mean, you know, it. I mean, it's such a huge component. Just the fact that you have been doing something for months, and that like denying yourself your instinctive kind of desires, and like how many things you said no to, how many times you battled with yourself and whatever. I mean, I if the better you get at this, like the less of that you need to do because you have like smart structures set up, but still you just miss that freedom element of eating and socializing and whatever. So yeah, like if you could eliminate all of that, I mean, holy shit, like how much easier it would be to get into the shape that you want.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to be said for that chronic fatigue. I mean, we've talked before about how somebody who's never done an extended period of time dieting, 3+ months, just can't really relate to the hunger. Like, I don't care how hungry you get on one day, it's just not relatable to somebody who's been hungry for months and months on end. But there's the physical aspect there, right? Which is just the actual hunger in that moment is a different type of hunger. But a huge portion of it is also just mentally that fatigue. I mean, if you were to snap your fingers right now and just your brain is now in the body of your super diet itself, it would suck, but you'd be, I imagine that you would probably be like, well, I am quite hungry, but I mean, I remember being just full the last like 3, 4 months. It's just not the same as like day after day after day after day. Same thing with chronic pain. You know, most people who are in chronic pain, there are people who kill themselves over chronic pain. It's very rare that chronic pain is a 9 out of 10. It's that it's a 4 or 5 out of 10 every single day, relentlessly with no end, right? That's that
Yeah.
real long-term exposure.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, with the hunger, and of course, like there are lots of things again that make it difficult to separate the physical from the mental, because okay, like you might be very hungry physically, but then if I threw you out of a plane or something, it, eventually your parachute would open up, but like for the first like 5 seconds it wouldn't. I'm guessing that you would not be hungry while falling. And even when you landed, like you would completely forget about the fact that you were hungry not that long ago, because your catecholamine levels would be like through the roof. And that's a physical effect, but obviously it changes your mental state. And like, let's like take a person who obviously is not falling from anywhere, but is just sitting in front of their computer, but they're like just they forgot get to eat, and they get by on very low calories, and they get like accidentally super skinny. And is that person just mentally wired that way, or is that also a physical effect? Like maybe they're so engaged with what they're doing that their catecholamine levels rise, maybe not as much, but like quite a bit more than the average person would have it. And that's a physical effect at that point, right? So it's hard to tell, but it's interesting.
Okay, so Ahmad says, how low of protein intake can I get away with? My best days are at 1.2 grams per kilogram. It's expensive where I live.
Yeah, so I think it's one thing to remember. First of all, in these cases, I do like to ask just in case, which I can't now, but I would if this person was talking to me directly, like, is this any kind of protein? Because some people only count protein sources or protein from like the highest quality sources, so like animal sources typically. But it's not the highest quality protein, but if you're eating, I don't know, like lettuce and potatoes and even fruits, like there's some protein in that. So are you counting that as well? And that's how you're getting to this 1.2 figure. But one thing that's good to remember is that it's not a cutoff point. So it's not like 1.6 grams per kilo or 1.8 grams per kilo, 0.8 grams per pound. It's not like that is the point where you start building muscle and retaining muscle. Um, it's all on a spectrum, and 1.2 grams per kilo is fairly close to what we believe to be the optimal figure, and like actually the number above which, I mean, really it seems like no study has found any benefits to my knowledge, is actually 1.6. The figure that we are more commonly recommending, that 1.8 grams or 0.8 grams per pound, there is more of a, like, there is a safety margin that's added on top of the figures that we actually found. So at 1.2 you're actually fairly close. So if you're 100 kilos, that's 120 grams versus 160. Like if you think about it, like compare, like 0 would be the lowest number that you could consume. I mean, you're quite some ways there towards the optimal. So those 40 grams, how much of a difference will that make? If it makes any difference, probably not that much. And probably still there's some difference between maintenance versus gaining. and then there's some difference between gaining or gaining the absolute theoretical maximal amount. So, and as with most things, usually the difference between those two is not that big. Like just like with muscle growth, like, you know, gaining any muscle versus gaining the maximal amount of muscle for a beginner, that will be quite a lot. For, you know, someone who has been training for even like 5 years, it's not even gonna be detectable potentially. So yeah, but it's hard to tell like how much you can get away with. Like get away with in what sense? To still gain muscle or to retain muscle? That would be just conjecture. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a fair question to ask. It's funny, I just haven't released a podcast at the time of this recording, but Brian Borsley and I just did a podcast. We were just talking about how it's funny for us to hear about some people saying they can't get their protein intake in. A lot of times it's women. We were talking about Rhonda Patrick, who said it's so hard for her to get, I think, even like not even close to 1 gram per pound. And, you know, she's 130 pounds. And I just think I can't imagine that being hard. But I think that's just because we've been in this space for so long. We're so used to the 1 gram per pound. I mean, even Peter Attia, to my surprise, was saying that a lot of people are going to find that difficult. And I guess it's just because the average person isn't used to that. Whereas since I was 13 years old, I was just pounding protein. Actually, when I was in college and following a lot of the DC stuff, I was having 2 grams per pound of protein, which was totally ridiculous. I was eating 300 plus grams of protein at 160 pounds, which was, again, just silly. And I then went down to 1 gram per pound and I saw no detriment at all. And if anything, obviously the food tasted much better because, I mean, you're trying to get 2 grams per pound on a 2,500 calorie, you know, if it was not a surplus day, is ridiculous. So the food was a lot better, less expensive. And again, just no difference in results whatsoever. And I've almost never seen somebody who really said, wow, I just saw so much better results at something like 2 grams per pound. Again, unless they're like these enhanced DC guys. And even half of them will say later, like, oh, once I dropped it, it didn't really matter. So I'm glad to see that that's pretty much been walked back and very few people would recommend it. And just one more further point there, sometimes they say, oh, it really helped me break back up or break through a plateau when I added 100 grams of protein. It's like, well, yeah, because you just added 400 plus calories, depending on the source, you know, maybe even twice that, depending on the source. So in any case, I think 1 gram per pound is a good standard, but then of course that also has to factor in your body fat, right? I mean, I have a client right now who's like 35% body fat. That person does not need 1 gram per pound of body weight, right? That it might be a little bit better to go 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, which is probably a better gauge anyway. It's just most of us, if you're in that, you know, 10 to 15% body fat range, it's not going to be such a big difference. And I'd rather you be a little bit, you know, error on the side of caution there. But I think what you said, how much of a difference is it really making? It's funny because when it comes to training and some of these other things, we do often talk about how you get the vast majority of the results from, you know, maybe like the 3 days per week or whatever it is that you're doing, however much volume. And yet we don't really talk about that as much with protein. It just kind of said, okay, 1 gram per pound, just get that. And it's very rarely nuanced to say, well, honestly, you'll get vast majority of the benefits, even if you have 0.7 grams per pound or something along those lines, right? We don't really hear that talked about so much. And even with myself, I mean, people often comment how I've experimented with so much over the years from different training and diets and everything, but I honestly have never had an extended period ever where I've had less than 1 gram per pound of protein. I just haven't done it. And I would imagine that at this point, because it's so much easier to maintain and I don't really gain much these days, I don't think I probably would see a difference. I think I'm about 200 pounds. If I had 100 grams of protein per day, I bet I would probably look almost identical, maybe a small difference there. But it's tough with the position I'm in, as I've mentioned before, just because something maintains muscle for me now doesn't mean it's what I would recommend to somebody who wants to gain as much muscle as possible. So just based on the evidence, I still say shoot for 1 gram per pound. It's hard to say how much can I get away with. Well, it's like, what do you mean by that? How much can you get away with and see results, or how much can you get away with and not like veer too far away from what's ideal. They're two very different questions. I'm sure you still see great results even on 80 grams per pound, or sorry, 80 grams per pound, something like 80 grams of protein. I'm sure you could still see great results with 0.5 grams of protein per pound, but what is going to be ideal and what I recommend to clients would probably be different than that.
Yeah, and then but plus like other things are influencing that as well. Like if you're shooting, like I think the lower you're going to get, like the more important it could be potentially to pay extra attention to these things like timing and distribution and all those things. Like, yeah, like for example, when you're eating 2 grams per pound, I would guess that it's a lot less important because like there's just so much stuff like floating around
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point because that is true. If you're talking about the quality of protein, Eric Trexler has some great stuff on this too. If you want to check out some of his stuff with mass and just, I think he's probably had articles on Stronger by Science about this stuff. That's great.
Yeah.
Because yeah, if you're a vegetarian and you're eating 0.7 grams per pound of protein, then yeah, you probably are going to have to care a little bit more when it comes to the timing of things, right? Maybe you want to get it within a closer window from when you worked out and whatnot. You just kind of have more wiggle room when you're eating 1 gram per pound. So I usually do shoot for 200. And that's one of the issues with, like, I hate to knock him, but Dom Mazzetti, the character, a lot of people know his like bro science videos. His actual name is Mike Tornabene. And he was from where I was in New Jersey, like very, very similar. But he just came out with some protein candy, and it's like, 20 grams of protein or whatever it is. But the protein is gelatin, right? And that's obviously not a very high quality source of protein, for our purposes here. So you have to look at the quality of that stuff too, because you could just throw in like a cheap product there, and people might think, I'm getting so much protein, but it's like, from oatmeal and gelatin and whatever, and that's not really what we're looking for.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so we got 1 or 2 more here. So opinions on reducing volume during a cut, as apparently it's easier to maintain muscle. You want to go with this one, Abel, because you've had a lot of successful cuts?
Yeah, so I had some cuts where I was stubborn and kept my volume up, even though I was losing strength quite fast by the end. It was definitely not a good idea. Also had some cuts where actually the first one, like really big cut that I did when I was younger. With that one, I actually dropped my volume a bit too much because I was following Martin Burkhan and some of these guys that were like, some of their routines were super, super low volume. That was not good. I actually ended up losing strength because previous to that was the first time where I actually hit some really nice strength PRs for myself at the time, and couldn't maintain a lot of that. And so honestly, at this point, like it's quite simple for me. Like if your volume is remotely appropriate for you, and you're not doing something special as an experiment like I did now with the back training. So, okay, I was doing like in total like 70 sets of back work or whatever. It's not because I thought I needed 70 sets. I was just like throwing the kitchen sink at it and like seeing if that's going to make a difference. If you're doing something like that and then you go into a cut, yeah, like that's probably not going to fly because it was barely tolerable while I was eating, everything in sight, and I was gaining a ton of fat and a ton of body weight, but I was obviously very, very well fed to recover. If I'm going into a cut, then yeah, like it will have to be tapered down. But if I was doing something like, I don't know, like 12 sets or something, which historically always treated me well, I'm not sure if that's the exact right amount for me, but like it must be in the ballpark at least. I think that should only be tapered down reactively, because I just don't see why you would taper it down proactively. I think that your recovery status will inform you whether that's needed or not. Now, again, that is if you're using a volume amount, which is like at least somewhat well informed. Like if you're just blasting yourself with a whole bunch of volume just for the sake of it, then yeah, probably you should be open to reducing that relatively fast if there are signs that you might not be recovering from this. So yeah, that's more or less what I think. How about you?
So for me, most people probably know that I am generally a fan of moderate volumes, sometimes even low volumes. It depends. I like to start people off with lower generally and see how they respond, and then I'll gradually kind of ramp them up from there. But most of my body parts are getting between 8 to 12 sets per week. Some in a certain phase might get up to 16, but it's usually not super high volume. So I definitely don't just go into a cut and say, all right, I'm just going to slash volume. There may be instances where I'm pretty deep into a cut where I'm really fatigued and I'll say, okay, maybe some of the volume that I added during a bulking phase to bring something up, I will now kind of take off and just go to maintenance. But I mean, if I think of my most successful cut, which was in 2020, most body parts other than back were getting 6 sets per week total. And I maintained pretty much everything during that cut. It was a very good cut for me. But even then, like I said, when I was bulking prior to that, it was only slightly more. So it's not something that I changed too much. I'm not really big on dramatic changes in volume as a stimulus. I think changes in frequency, I think obviously changing your calories depending on your goal, different exercises can be great. But you're not going to see me recommending somebody start with 6 and ramp up to 24 sets per week. It's just not something that I really believe in.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like how much our thinking has. I mean, obviously, like there are no revolutionary things in the world of training, at least not within a span of like whatever 5 years. But like I remember Lane Norton said something back in 2014, 15, which I'm sure he would never say that now, is that like I remember someone asking him this pretty much, and he's like, no, like volume should not be going down on a cut. If anything, volume should go up. Like if you think about it, like why would your body maintain your muscle if you're taking away the stimulus? And it's interesting, like even someone like him could like still fall for that, logical fallacy of more is always better.
Mm-hmm.
And like definitely not be saying it now. I would be shocked if he did. So
Mike Israetel, I remember. So when I first came across him, it was 2017, I want to say. And so I didn't really know much about him. And somebody sent me his Facebook page. And one of the first posts I saw was him saying that, people know that it was often a myth in the, I don't know, 80s and so that you in 90s that you want to do higher reps to cut, right? Because that's going to give you the shreds and whatnot, right? And then it was kind of showing, okay, that's obviously BS. And he was putting up a post saying that you should go to higher reps while cutting because it'll burn a little more calories and it's better for volume. It's a good way to get increased volume. And I just remember being so shocked. I was like, what? Like, this is a guy who's supposed to be, this, like, I don't know. I don't want to say guru, but this is a guy who's supposed to be this great mind in the space. And he's telling people to go to high reps when dieting. Like, how is this possible? And now his reasoning was different, right? His reasoning was more for the sake of volume as a stimulus and not because high reps are going to lead to shreds or anything like that. But I believe he would probably walk back that statement now as well, because I just don't find that to be great advice for people. You're losing, like if you were just to switch all of your reps to higher reps in the 20 to 30 range, for example, that is certainly not advice I would be giving anybody.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like even relatively recently, and I don't really know what to attribute that to, because it's certainly not like, so I'll say first what that is. But Mike, like I frequently heard things from him that basically like gave it away that he thinks that higher, like heavier weights and lower reps are more fatiguing than lighter loads and higher reps, which, I mean, unless someone is like training super far away from failure, which, okay, this is a pretty high ball to slam down to make some jokes about, but like Mike lifts some super, super heavy weights. So I'm really surprised that he feels this way because like if he does high reps, I mean, that's gonna be crazy fatiguing, I would imagine. And for me, definitely, like even like 10 reps can be kind of overwhelming on some stuff. Whereas like 5 reps, like yeah, it's very like it can be hard on the joints, but as far as like which one is more fatiguing, I mean, the higher reps definitely are more fatiguing, and I would think that for most people it is. Sure, some people have some
Sure.
amazing cardio, but Mike like repeatedly said things that kind of alluded to this. So
Well, I know a lot of
I
people
don't
would
know what.
argue that the lower rep ranges with higher weights would be more demanding from a quote unquote CNS standpoint, right? And that was kind of talked about, like it's just, because of the high loads. And then I think more recently it has been discussed that no, it's actually more the peripheral nervous system, and that actually no, the higher reps are more fatiguing. I remember, and I think once you start getting to fatigue and the nervous system, you start getting into some theoretical arguments. But if we're just talking about difficulty, of course, higher reps to failure are way harder, I think, for most people. And I remember I brought this up before a long time ago, but on the T Nation forums, there was this guy. Never saw any pictures of him, but his name was Encephalic Carnage, and he never really showed his pictures or anything. But it was him, Professor X, and they were both around 300 pounds. And I remember him saying this Professor X character was a leaner version of than he was. So I'm like, okay, well, this Professor X guy is kind of fat. So that you must be like this fat, enhanced powerlifter, which in thinking back makes sense based on the things he was saying. And I remember saying how higher reps were just so much harder. And he goes, oh, well, if that's what you think, then you just aren't conditioned. And I'm thinking, what person would think that a 10 rep max squat, for example, is not harder than a 1 rep max squat? I just can't imagine. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong, a 1 rep max, like they can be extremely hard. You got to mentally psych yourself up. But you're actually considering a true 0 RAR 10 rep squat or dead. I mean, that's just absolutely horrible. So from a difficulty standpoint, yeah, no question.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, guys. So that is the end here of the whole Q&A part 2 here on Abel's channel. Abel, thank you for joining me as always. And I guess I
Thank
would
you.
normally say to where can we find you, but I guess if people are listening, they're on yours already. So go over to the Brains and Gains channel. I'll put my channel here. Check out part 1 over there.
Indeed, guys.
And and Abel, I mean, again, people are going to know this on your channel, but do you want to talk any more about your book, about where to find it, and all that?
Oh, yeah. Thank you for that question. So if you go on ssdable.com/book, you can find it there. And yeah, like in my YouTube videos, I'm gonna be spamming it in the video description. But yeah, really cool book. From what I've heard, people seem to like it, and it's about how to put together awesome training programs. Basically, the description of the book is the title, in a sense.
Awesome. All right. Thanks again, man.
Thank you.